Welcome everybody to What Now, our talk show where we bring thought leaders from around the world, and we have explored many different topics around money systems, how money works, and especially in this current scenario of COVID and sort of post-COVID situation around our world. And today I have a very interesting topic, which is very close to my heart as well, around FairShares commons and regenerative business models. Talking about sustainable money systems, we have to also look at the sustainable business solutions and ecosystems, and how do we sustain our businesses and organizations. And this is the kind of work we also do in our Transform Communiversity. I have with me my colleague from Transform Communiversity Associates, my friend, colleague, Robert Delner. He's joining me as my co-host today. And Robert's new book on impact investment has just come out. So we are quite excited that a lot is happening in our own community as well. And with us are very, how do I say, I'm so inspired by him because I keep following him on Twitter and everywhere. Graham Boyd, he's joining us from Belgium. So welcome, Graham. It's good to have you here. I'm quite excited, and wow, what an inspiring profile you have. Especially, you know, I mean, I was just trying to connect the dots of grew up in South Africa, studied particle physics as well. And now I think he's bringing his physics as a physicist. He's bringing that knowledge into developing sustainable business ecosystems, especially regenerative business ecosystems, which is something that I'm quite interested in knowing as well. So starting off with Graham, or in fact, how about bringing Robert in firstly, because Robert is the one who has introduced us to Graham as well. Welcome, Robert. How are we doing today?
We're doing very well, thank you. And yes, I've known Graham now for a number of years, and we have traveled together a distance in both our respective journeys. And Graham and I first started to talk about, what is really the new, what could be the new business models or the evolving business models from where we are today in the world. We both come from having worked with large organizations, and we've seen both the good, the bad, and the ugly working in or within large organizations, both culturally and individually, and the limitations of those. And we've been working, I think, more intensively maybe over the last year or two in trying to bring forth a more cohesive and institutionalized form of not only corporate structures, but also in terms of how such corporate structures can be governed. So handing over to Graham, I would just like to sort of start off maybe setting the tone a little bit. And if you can sort of just take us through some of the territory which you have seen over the last sort of decade or two coming out of what we can then call, let's say, the neoliberalist or the sort of more traditional conventionalist form of corporate structures, shareholder structures, and where you think the impulses have been coming from, and just to give us a bit of background and history maybe to, how we've ended up where we are today. But before you do, please also, of course, introduce yourself.
Yes, and please do mention.
So
yeah,
I'm a little bit ahead of the game.
Yeah, and do tell us about this particle physics connection here.
I'm sure you will. Thanks, Graham.
Thank you, Anika, and thank you, Robert. So the particle physics connection and the South African connection is very, very deep in everything that I'm doing. The particle physics side of it is, it gives me a lens to look at the world through. And some elements of that lens are on the other one hand, looking at what are the fundamental entities and what are the different ways that they interact with each other. That's the essence of particle physics. And one of the things that's in the magic of physics is that the recognition that our natural languages are simply designed for experiences that are about the size of a human being. We cannot use natural language to talk about what actually is at the quantum level, very small, or at the relativistic level, very large. The only language that can talk about that is the language of mathematics, which is not a language that most of us are comfortable using. And that's very relevant to today's world. Many of the issues that we're wrestling with at the global scale are simply because the lenses we're looking through and the language that we're trying to use isn't capable of grasping what actually is. And so physics helps me to see that. In particular, at the heart of that is, people talk about the wave particle duality, or the paradox between, is it a wave or is it a particle? And that was a major paradigm shift in the physics world 100 years ago, when physicists finally got to the point of realizing that there actually is no paradox in nature. There is nothing in nature that is either wave or particle. An electron is what it is. It's just that when we try to talk about it, sometimes it's the closest to talk about it as a wave, and at other times it's the closest to talk about it as a particle, but it itself is neither exactly one nor exactly the other. Yeah. And in today's world, there's so much in neoclassical economics, which is an attempt to tell the economy what it should be, rather than looking at the economy as something that is way too complex and big and nebulous for us to ever be able to describe in any normal human language, and simply accept that there are inherent paradoxes and contradictions. There's an inherent unknowability in the economy, and we have to live with that. Just as physicists will tell you that physics is the study of what we can say about what is. It's not the study of what is. Similarly, I believe that economics ought to be seen as the study of what we can say about an economy. It's not a study of the economy itself, as it actually is.
I just love it. This is so beautifully explained. Seriously. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot more that I could say about that, but that
we would be digressing from our
exactly.
Yes.
I'll just
maybe another day I can have you and I can have a dialogue around this. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. We can gladly do that. I'll just plant a seed in that with my co-author. We have laid the foundations or the seeds to catalyze what we're calling a general theory of economies.
Wow.
Which is like general relativity. The proposal is to find ways of integrating across the entire pluralistic spectrum of economic studies to get to a point of really looking at a general theory of economies that is the study of what can we say about economies, rather than a prescription of what an economy should be.
I know, because I think there is a danger when people start using those terminologies. Say, for example, we use in our transform community as well, the regenerative economy and regeneration of societies. It's too big and huge and complex topic or terminology for anyone to understand. I've seen so many people coming back saying, what do you mean by this? You know, what do you mean by regenerating societies and cultures? It's too deep and complex a topic. So I think this is beautiful how you've broken it down in scientific and somewhat esoteric for me as well level, because we keep on talking about the invisible, the intangible, the unknowable. So thank you. So coming to, I think you've explained particle physics and the connection you've made with your regenerative business ecosystem, and that's what you're working on. If you can, now we can speak about FairShares Commons as well, especially in the context of what relevance it has in our today's world, because we've seen that the cooperative movement, you know, the social capital movement, and the welfare states, which have sort of, you know, collapsing that structure, or it never worked. Maybe it was a farce. We don't know. I would like to hear from you. So how would FairShares Commons would be different? Or is it the need of our time? Is it too futuristic? If people can't understand the concept?
I will jump into that gladly. And this connects completely with the South African part of my background and the physics part of my background. And it's also a consequence of having spent a decade with Procter & Gamble as a manager, both in Belgium and in China, having really experienced multinational business from the inside and experienced what I find most of my colleagues in P&G were, to a greater or lesser extent, aware of the imperative to fit in with nature, to have a business that could thrive within nature. P&G's purpose is to improve the lives of the world's consumers. You know, in many ways, you couldn't ask for a better purpose in a for-purpose company. Yeah, and P&G's roots have very, very deep values. And for example, P&G is one of the few companies that does not have a vision. It has purpose, values, and principles, which are far more conscious and anchored than a typical company which has a vision of what the world should be, and a vision that says, we will be the best in doing that and everybody else is secondary, which is exclusive and does not allow for collaboration and long-term success. And so in the mid-2000s, when I was in China, one of the things that I lived through in China was the SARS coronavirus 1. And the reaction, seeing the reaction, how the Beijing authorities progressed through their understanding of what was happening and what they needed to do, which is one of the reasons why I look at what's happening today. Nothing that is happening with SARS coronavirus 2 is actually a surprise to me. And if you look at some of the articles that were written in the 12 to 24 months after SARS coronavirus 1, you know, everything that's happening now has been predicted. There is nothing happening now that was unpredictable. So one of the questions that we ought to be asking ourselves now is, what has prevented us? What is it in ourselves as individuals and our institutions and our organizations and our culture that has left us, most countries, so seriously ravaged, both in terms of human cost and of course in economic cost? You know, and I compare it to certain countries where, you know, like South Korea and Germany, where they have a very low death rate, the lightest possible impact, because they were prepared and they implemented their plans immediately.
Interesting.
Now let me tie that back to South Africa. in South Africa, I grew up in apartheid South Africa. I doubt that any long-lasting, viable society could ever have been developed in South Africa with the apartheid structure as the foundation that everything was being built on. You know, I don't think any values-based leader could have come in. I don't think any cultural transformation tool could have come in. I don't think that any other technology could have come in and built a fully viable South Africa if the underlying governance model was apartheid. It wouldn't have worked.
True.
And that has been an inspiration for me as I've been asking myself for the past 15 years, why has the triple bottom line, circular economy, conscious capitalism, values-based leadership, wherever you look, why haven't these done anything more than slow us down in our headlong plummet into a climate emergency, all of the issues reflected in the 17 SDGs, the current SARS-CoV-2 crisis that we're in? Why haven't those been able to turn the ship around? Why have they, at best, simply throttled back? And the conclusion I came to was that it has much in common. There's much we can learn from the apartheid context of South Africa. So, in very simple terms, apartheid comes from Dutch roots, and it has two elements. There's apart, which just means separation.
Yes.
Things that in actuality are connected or part of a whole are artificially separated from each other. And the hate, which is just the Dutch suffix, meaning it's a context of, or a state of, or a situation of. So the lesson for us from apartheid is that whenever we're in a situation of separation, when what is actually part of a bigger whole is hard separated from each other, you have a dysfunctional system that you cannot repair in any way without addressing this fundamental state of separation. And in the parallels that I see in the world of South Africa, if you happen to be lucky enough to have a white skin, you had all of the voting rights in the elections to steer the country into the future, and all of the share of wealth generated. And that was both dysfunctional on a practical level for almost everybody and deeply morally wrong. Most of the country, most of humanity could not be themselves. They could not live fulfilled lives. They could not thrive. And therefore, from a purely practical sense, they couldn't be a fully engaged part of an economy. And if I look at business today, well, what do we have? We have a context of separation. Only if you are lucky enough to have enough money to invest, do you have voting rights in the annual general meeting and the power to steer the company into the future, and a share of the wealth gained, both in terms of capital appreciation and a share of the dividends.
But if I just jump in here, especially in the context of how you've very well explained the apartheid in South Africa, isn't this the case for our world psyche? It's too late now. When you're saying that, you know, the separation, it's like now in our psyche. How do we, is it too late, do you think, that our formative years, like a child's formative years, we've spent in this you know, separation mode, right? And we are now so, it's habitual as well, that this is how everybody now thinks. Do you think that we can now start afresh, go back and say, okay, this is the root cause. I know the agenda is too big, the lens is too wide, that the whole world, we can't do it. And we say, okay, let's start with one country, one society, but that's separation as well, because if you look at how integral consciousness also works, it's like, then that country or that society is way ahead of others, you know. I mean, I'm just going into that philosophical, you know, but I don't know. Do you think there could be a solution that we can just start afresh?
We don't have a choice.
Okay.
Or let's say it's a Hobson's choice of either we simply give up or we keep going towards removing separation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's at the essence of everything that I'm up to. And you know, on my side, Robert and I were talking this morning because the past couple of weeks, I've been in a place of feeling less and less hope and optimism for the future, more and more despair, and questioning, has everything that I've invested over the past 15 years, both in terms of actual cost, you know, in terms of time, money, relationships, all of these 6 integrated reporting initiative capitals that I've invested, as well as all of the opportunity costs, the things that I could have done, which would have paid me lots of money, but would not have contributed to what we're doing. Has it been worthwhile?
Join the club. We're all in it together.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there are times when I'm in deep despair about the possibility of doing anything. At the same time, at least consciously, if not always in my feelings, I'm able to remind myself that I had the same despair as a teenager growing up in South Africa, thinking that there was no possible way of any kind of a viable journey out of apartheid, that it could only end in an extreme revolution that would be a complete car crash for a decade or two, and that maybe then we would be able to rebuild something out of that complete collapse of the system. Now, leaving aside questions about all of the work that still has to be done in South Africa and all of the opportunities that have been squandered in the past decade, what often keeps me going is the recognition that South Africa had a far better transition than I was at any point able to imagine or hope for up until, well, actually until after the transition had happened. You know,
Wow. Yeah.
and that's what keeps me going now, is the belief that even though I can't see any realistic, viable path that I know will get us to the point of oneness that we need to have a viable society where everybody can be themselves, can thrive, and everybody has a sufficient standard of living. You know, I don't see a clear linear path there from where we are now. But I do hope that if we keep going, if we keep laying the bricks, if we keep making the path by walking it, then at some point we will come around a corner and see something that we can't see from where we're standing now. And so long as we keep moving, so that we can get to a point where we can stand in a different place, then maybe we can see something different.
Very right. I totally agree with you. We can't stop. We should not stop. Because, so what do we have here? You're going to explain.
Yes, so what we have here we've been touching around the first three levels here of what we're working on. So the FairShares Commons, which is level 4, that's about addressing the context of separation between all of the different stakeholders in an organization or a business. And the FairShares Commons is designed, well, and there are multiple ways of actually constructing a FairShares Commons. They work in pretty much every country. You can find a way of constructing it. There's one version that I've done for a few companies in the UK. So I know how to build the UK version of the FairShares Commons. We're working with Swiss clients on how do we build something that has the FairShares Commons essence under Swiss company law, similarly in the US, similarly in other countries in Europe. So this is not unrealistic pie in the sky that requires the law to change before we can begin. This is something that we can do right now in practically every country to take a huge step forwards. And the whole essence of this is recognizing that by structuring a limited company as the property of the investors to buy or sell as if it were property, compromises badly the power of the company to do what it's there to do, to succeed as an organization. If it's a business, to really succeed as a business, and in particular, if it's meant to be a regenerative business or a circular economy business or any of those, if it's built on the context of separation of a normal company, it cannot succeed. The circular economy cannot work if we incorporate with anything less than a cooperative. A cooperative is, a multi-stakeholder cooperative. A mono-stakeholder worker cooperative, customer cooperative is also fundamentally unsuitable to build a circular economy, let alone a regenerative economy. And even those are not really suitable for circular regenerative because they lack what's really in the FairShares Commons, which is to fully recognize the role of all 6 capital types, to fully recognize the need to have a natural currency for each capital type, to fully recognize that all of these capitals, including the human beings, the energy of human beings, the intellect of human beings, all of those together, if they're to serve the long term, have to be governed as a commons of productive capacity. And that's what the FairShares Commons is all about.
Wonderful.
What that then turns into is everybody has an obligation to steward the commons wisely long into the future. That also means that it cannot be bought or sold. It cannot be treated as property. And that's the one area where within current legislation, we do the best we can to eliminate as best possible all possibility of selling the company. But until the law changes, that's not going to be really watertight. And so what we need, and we already see good signs of this in places like New Zealand. New Zealand has declared rivers, mountains. They have fully recognized that they are fully a legal person, cannot be owned, bought, or sold by anybody, and have the full right to sue. That also means they can actually be held accountable for what is done.
Yes, I think in India as well. There are 2 rivers in India. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Now, let's take this by analogy. If you look at the ICC definition of slavery, it's the application of any or all of the concepts of property to a person. Now, that doesn't matter whether it's a human legal person or a non-human legal person. treating a company as the property of the investors has the same kind of DNA, the same essence as treating a human person as property. And just as you cannot hold a slave accountable for what the slave has to do under risk of death, if not, you can't hold them accountable. But it's the owner of the slave that you hold accountable. But then the laws around slavery in that era were structured in such a way that the slave owner was not accountable either. And so everything fell through the cracks and nothing could be done. It was only at the point where we not only recognized that the application of property was certainly morally wrong, that had been known for a long time. What was really the end of slavery was the point where everybody started to recognize that this was economically poor as well, that it was economically far better for everybody to be fully free to engage as free agents in the economy.
So could I ask you a question that could this be applied to a societal structure or governance as well? Because I do understand this is for organizations, but now especially in our current day scenario, we're looking at how societies are struggling or the world at large is struggling. So do you think this could also be applied to the governance of a country or society? I think this would actually work.
Absolutely. And that's why I have all 6 levels up here. I see them as the same essence at each level. Level 6 is local ecosystems. And for my work, I'm primarily pointing at local business ecosystems, say small circular economies or the business ecosystem of a city. And then ecosystems of ecosystems, which would be national and global. But what you're saying is absolutely true. This is all applicable to all of those. And if I connect it with what we were saying at the beginning, the heart of all 6 of these levels is how do we find practical, pragmatic ways that we can use now to recognize where is there a context of separation? What can we do to harness the tension that comes out of that context of separation to grow in integrity, to grow towards something that is viable without it turning into an idealistic swamp of nobody's allowed to be themselves and we all have to toe the common line.
Yes. I say let's, if we can inspire a country, let's do it. Why not?
Yes, exactly.
Why is Robert so quiet?
I'm listening to Graham with interest, but I will come in now. I think, obviously, as you know, Graham, I'm a huge admirer, and I underwrite everything you would say there. In my experience, the difficulty, and I think you hit the nail when you said ideology. I mean, we talked earlier about neoclassical economics and neoliberalism, etc., to progressivism. Where are we going with this? In my background as in investment banking, one of the hardest barriers was always in and around the power of capital, or the power of the owner, and the contractual arrangements that you have to make with the owner of capital in terms of control, in terms of rights, in terms of stepping in terms of governance, etc., etc. It was virtually dominated, I would say, by the mindset and the way that capital would be attracted to your investment. And that is still, I think, one of the biggest barriers we have. In some cultures, and I take my own here, Sweden as an example, I guess, or the Nordic region, where there has been over decades a more open, a more egalitarian, a more stakeholder-driven culture, which kind of created the seedbed for some of the success stories we've had up in the Nordics, where people feel at least that there are organizations to which they would like to belong. However, in the last couple of decades, again, neoliberalism has kind of ruled the roost. And if you go to places like Sweden now, there's very little understanding, hearsay, and really willingness to engage with anything else, because as we know, success talks and money talks. So I guess my question to you would be, where do you see the cracks in the soil in which the seed can fall in this, and how do you think that the commercial world will start looking at these type of incorporations, these various forms of stakeholder incorporations, that then actually in effect drives value? I mean, that seemed to me also to be a hurdle today, that we believe in the neoclassical view that money drives value, money drives motivation, it's an extrinsic motivation. And as you said very early on, Graham, the alternatives haven't really quite sunk in yet, the benefits from them. So I'm just curious to in my experience, the barrier is still kind of there. The ideology of where we have, what we have is still there. You can see kind of chinks in the armory or chinks in the wall, but it's still quite a difficult barrier, because capital itself, if you're looking for capital, as I said, it kind of seeks its own structures and retention of what I would actually call the power complex, money, property, prestige, control, and so forth. So how do you see this kind of, I know you said there isn't a clear road forward, but how do you see, how do you actually, when you talk to clients, how do you introduce this as part of your, let's say, solution to really generate value, not only for the capital holder, the financial capital holder, but now as a regenerative, sustainable business model?
Could I quickly add just a little? It's actually in extension to what Robert is saying. And I shared with you in the beginning that people who have been viewing our talks on What Now, some of them say they are very esoteric. And I would say, no, it's exactly what we are discussing here. And Robert is also saying that out there, it's still the mindset is business as usual. So, where are we at with all this? Over to you.
Thank you. So it's a great question, and it spans at least the first 4 levels here. So I'll dive into it. Let me take a couple of practical examples. First of all, from the world of big money. There is a company that probably everybody watching this will have at least 1 square of plastic in their wallet that has a 3-color logo on it, the Visa Corporation. And until not too long ago, the Visa Corporation in the US and in Europe was structured in ways that have much of the FairShares commons in it. The Visa Corporation was founded as a joint stock company where the shares could not be bought or sold. The company as a whole could not be bought or sold. It was structured in ways that satisfy most of the criteria of a commons. And that was by design by Dee Hock, who was the first CEO and really the catalyst that enabled all of these competing banks who were attempting to create the credit card industry to come together and form the Visa Corporation. Now, what was the driver for that? What was the crack that allowed this to happen? Was the recognition amongst the banks that every single one of them was hemorrhaging money, and they were at serious risk of collapsing the bank if they didn't find another way of doing business in this completely new paradigm of the emerging credit world, of credit cards as a tool of spending. So another example is Bridgewater, the world's largest and consistently highly successful hedge fund. And they consciously practice many of the things that are in levels 1 and 2 in our adaptive way. And Ray Dalio, the founder and CEO, has written a couple of brilliant books talking about the Bridgewater way and how vital it has been for their success as one of the world's most powerful and successful hedge funds to operate in a way that deeply recognizes the tension within each person as a source of developmental direction, energy, so that each person can grow to be a stronger and more powerful human being, and through that, a more powerful contributor to the financial success of Bridgewater. And equally at level 2, that's where the culture is, harnessing the tension in people's interactions with each other to shine light on where is the culture insufficient to meet the challenge, the business challenges that they're addressing at that point in time. So many businesses are often blind or at best partially sighted in terms of how the business as a whole runs at levels 1 and 2. They rely completely on each individual carrying the full load. And as Peter Drucker said, that's a complete waste of an organization's capacity. An organization is there to carry the load across all of the people in the organization so that every single person is in the best position to be their full selves and contribute all they can. And if somebody is not able to contribute all they can, it's because the organization has failed them. And how the organization fails them is fundamentally by having contexts of separation that have inherent tensions in them and simply maintaining them, ignoring them, increasing the separation, rather than looking and saying, hey, we have a context of separation here. Is it something that is structurally necessary? Like, I wouldn't be very stable on my legs if I joined my left and right legs together. I need them to be separate so that I can walk effectively in balance. But they're joined at the hip. They're part of one body. And my brain, my torso, and my legs know that it's one body. And this context of separation is a tactical one rather than an inherent one. So, let's work at levels 1 and 2 on that. That lets the light in. That, coming back to what Robert said, one of the biggest barriers are our own individual beliefs, the mythologies that we have created and bought into ourselves, and the collective culture, the mythologies of the whole. And
love for money, you mean love for money.
Exactly, whether it's love for money or, for instance, one of the challenges to make changes, and let me say to make a big change in how the economics profession engages with each other as individuals and with the whole institution of neoliberal economic thinking or neoliberalism and neoclassical economics. A classic stage of self-identity, and my inner mythology is my self-identity, is what's called the expert stage. And that is a stage that is still dependent on other people's opinion. basically somebody who is at the expert stage of development says, I'm okay if I am recognized by others as an expert, as a member of the club of this expertise. And until somebody has recognized the inner conflict that they're in because of that, between their different roles in life as a, let's say, as a member of society, as a friend, as a partner in a family, and that mythology of my identity as an expert, I am an expert, is my identity. Until they recognize that, any attempt to bring some cracks into the wall of the edifice of neoclassical economics isn't simply an interesting opportunity to explore what it is that I can viably say about an economy. It's a threat to my identity, a threat to my right to exist as a human being. And so you get enormously strong reactions coming out. And that's one of the biggest handicaps. And so the route forwards is very much as, the SARS coronavirus 2 is a point where far more people than in the SARS coronavirus 1 have had to deeply question what they believe and what they place their trust in. And so that all points at, if we truly want organizations to work, we need to adopt the kinds of things that, let's say, Bridgewater is doing. We need to adopt the kind of things around level 4 that Visa pioneered so well, a radically different, inclusive ways of incorporating. Nobody can argue that those two companies were not successful. We need to look at companies like Mondragon in Spain, a multinational, 80,000 strong employees. And during the 2008 recession, in the Spanish Mondragon businesses did not add one single person to the Spanish unemployment statistics, which is simply testimony to how anti-fragile they are as businesses. They are phenomenally successful businesses, regardless of whether times are good or bad. They remain phenomenally successful. And that is because they're incorporated as a cooperative. It's because they're deeply run on ways of being and ways of interacting that are very close to what we have in our adaptive way. And they have elements of how they organize, how they take decisions on a day-to-day practical executive level that are very different to the traditional command and control organizational hierarchy. And what that means is that Mondragon itself is a highly anti-fragile local ecosystem of businesses, and maybe even an ecosystem of ecosystems, because they are now a multinational.
But I think, Graham, if I would come in, between us, we know that who actually after Mondragon replicated the Mondragon, it was a successful model. So this is a question for all of us. I think Robert wants to also add something here.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I think the issue, and I think you put it very eloquently, Graham, the issue also from a cultural perspective, and this has also been my experience working with some companies up in Sweden and also here, of course, is that, we live in a culture right now of polarity, of digitization, of simplification. We live with, short, sharp messages of communication. We haven't learned to embrace complexity, live with ambiguity, deal with the conflict, the tensions which exists. So it's very easy to look at everything we've said so far as some form of ideology.
Yeah.
And I want to make it very, very clear. It's not an ideology. Right? It's far beyond that. And the question, I think, and this is what's always been fascinating for me, is that many particular senior executives heavily invested in their, as you call, their expertise and their positioning and what they have created. They find it very difficult to look at what, even in evolutionary terms, what would be the next steps that they might be able to take for their organizations and for their people, etc. But so the question would be, to me, is like, what would you say would be the one thing that someone listening to this maybe could say, if they come to this point now in listening and saying, well, it's all very well, good, but
Yes.
what can I do? What's the one thing I think, I can do to sort of at least plant the seed somewhere and just experiment, just see how it goes, introduce it, work with it, use it as a laboratory, and find out what actually could potentially work for me.
The one thing to start with is to, every time you look at your own cell phone, smartphone, mobile phone, whatever you call it, to bring back to mind a company by the name of Nokia, which was once the dominant player in the global cell phone market and is now almost vanished.
Forgotten, yeah.
Yes. And this is, we're talking about 10 years that they've gone from hero to zero. Keep that in mind. Why did Nokia go from hero to zero? And if you have slightly longer memories, why is Kodak almost non-existent?
Yeah.
And yet they invented the digital camera. Kodak ought to be the major supplier of digital camera technology to every single cell phone company in the world, because they had first mover advantage. Why did they lose it? And if you want to go even further back for old folk who have memories, Xerox invented in their Palo Alto Research Center almost all of the technology, the human interface user experience of the modern computer. Why are they not the world's dominant player in computers? And I think simply that one thing of keep that at the top of your mind. Why? Because the heart of why lies in each case. They were unable, there were too many tensions within the individuals. And so they couldn't really act for the good of the organization. Too many people were putting too much of their time into defending their vulnerabilities, defending their mythology. They couldn't talk to each other effectively. And in particular, those few people who were actually seeing where the future was going, that message was not being heard clearly. The tension was causing tension in people. And they reacted to that tension. Instead of embracing it, surfacing it, really using it as the resource it is, they shut it down. So that would then be the second thing I would say is, get really good at making friends with your own vulnerability by mastering things like the pattern of dialogue in nonviolent communication, or master things like Keegan's immunity to change. Our adaptive way includes both of those into a synergy between the two. So really put effort into working on yourself, developing your capacity to work with your own inner tension, the tension with other people. Go off and take a few Aikido classes and learn how to work with the energy of somebody attacking you. Anything like that, so long as it's about how can we work with rather than against the differences between us in such a way that the differences between us become visible, like left leg and right leg, as part of a bigger whole. Yeah. And then the third thing I would say then is, in terms of how you're working as an organization, instead of coming to decisions in the typical way of the opinion of the strongest person wins, or the opinion of the largest number of people wins, and you simply ignore everything else, work with what I would call consent decision-making or integrative decision-making, where you listen to the reasons why each person thinks that a certain proposal might be too dangerous to even try once, not even safe enough for now, not even good enough for now. Listen to that and understand whether that is the early warning signal that only that person has access to, that is telling you, you are about to make a Kodak decision. You are about to make a Nokia decision. If you fail to recognize this weak early warning signal that that person and only that person has tapped into. Yeah. And as a final example of what I'm talking about, there is a company called Adobe these days, which, you know, it's a huge global player in the computer industry. The founders used to work for Xerox. The starting point was what they developed within the Palo Alto Research Center. And when Xerox was not willing to listen to them, when what they were saying was a tension that the rest of Xerox could not handle, there was no way of reaching consent. And so people were not hearing what they were saying as the early warning signals of where the future will be. And there was no FairShares Commons that would enable everybody else to engage. They said, well, okay, can we buy the IP? And Xerox said, well, this is not going to be worth much. You can have it for $2,000. So they bought all of the IP for $2,000, went off and founded Adobe, and now that's
wonderful.
The future. So thank you very much.
Very nice dialogue. Thank you. Bye for now.
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thank you, Anika. Thank you, Robert. And I wish the two of you a wonderful day.